to talk about today, we're actually doing one of these tandem presentations. So it's a little bit like Paul and Terry yesterday, except because of all the wonderful talks that we've had in the last day and a half, I have much less work to do, so that's a nice thing. I presented the beautiful package for Natasha's gift that she will describe in her part of the talk, and that package has now been kind of unopened already by you guys, but that's okay because I can review some other things. So, but the way we're gonna do this is I'm gonna present a little bit of kind of introductory background, and then I'm gonna turn it over to Natalia, and she's gonna present the simulation results that we published, and then I'll come back and try to give some implications of the work to the literature. Okay. I want to just say up front that this work is a collaborative effort between the four of us, including Louis Nairns and Ragnar Steingrimson, who's back there in the audience. And what we're doing is we're using evolutionary game theory to look at some human behavior, and we're doing this because it seems to apply very well to the type of behavior we're going to be looking at. So in evolutionary game theory, it's thought of that color is a signaling system. In particular, in nature, color is thought to signal across different species. For example, these autumn colors signal insects to stay away from the trees in autumn because they carry a poison that will kill the young offspring in the spring. And signaling systems have been well established and studied in the animal signaling literature, as well as in the economics and game theory literature by people like David Lewis in his book on convention, and Maynard Smith in animal signaling, and more recently Brian Skirms, who's applied this to social structure. And these are these guys with their books. Brian Skirms is in LPS here at UC Irvine, and I'm sorry, in Logic and Philosophy of Science department.
And also Institute for Mathematical Behavior.
Exactly, exactly. And these books have been very influential recently because they've applied this evolutionary game theory to the domain of a kind of social structure and have made a big splash in the area. Just to let you know that what we're doing has a strong foundation. There's been a number of Nobel Prizes awarded for people who have worked in areas that are either directly related or kind of relevant to evolutionary game theory. There's a whole lot of formal modeling and mathematics behind it, and we're drawing upon that wealth of modeling that's present in the area. Now, we can think of color in nature as a signaling system because displaying and perceiving color in different species plays an important role in things like mate selection. So, for example, this male guppy, who's very colorful, displays lots of colors because this female guppy has the perceptual apparatus to actually see all those colors and make choices about and have preferences about the colors in mate selection. And we can think of color naming in humans as a signaling system as well, because it's an example of how a color name signals a color in human discourse. Okay? And the mainstream theory about color categorization as a signaling system or communication device is one that has a long history, ranging from almost 40 years now, from the original work by Berlin and Kay and Lenenberg and Roberts and people like that, through some psychophysical types of studies, and more recently by the work you heard yesterday from Terry regarding the World Color Survey and the colleagues involved in that. I want to say that historically there's been an emphasis on kind of perceptual processing-based explanations for the phenomenon, and that has evolved into some other interesting perspectives, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And as you know from Terry's presentation yesterday, this is the classical grid that I'm going to be showing again because I just want to remind you I'm going to be drawing upon it in the studies that we use. And I don't know if Terry said, but in this survey, it's a very extensive and very rich and important database of basically 110 pre-industrialized societies that have unwritten language, and there's really nothing else like it as a corpus in the world, so it's a very useful set of data. Okay, this is the Mercator projection or this is the stimulus that this is a Mercator projection of, and here's the bump that Terry was talking about yesterday, one up in yellow and one up in blue, and the idea is that these irregularities in the color space impose a structure that similarly makes differences in terms of how categorization systems are formed on that space. Okay, and the overarching result of all this work that's been done over these years is that if you have a grid like this and you run it through these 110 different societies, basic color terms name all the colors, and there are, even though you have different numbers of color terms occurring across different languages, you get this kind of result where each language has some subset of the basic color terms in their lexicon. Okay. Now, the interesting thing that Terry touched upon yesterday is that you have individual differences within languages. So this slide comes from a talk by Del Lindsay, who was here and gave a presentation. This is a language from Indonesia called Barik. And as you can see, you have a considerable amount of individual variation across these 5 subjects that speak the same language, and very similar to what Terry showed. But some of them seem to have different systems. Like this one seems to have a GRU type of system compared to other kinds that look more similar to what you might see in like an English type of system. The interesting thing about this research is that individual differences in human color categorization have really not been emphasized in the modeling aspect of it. This is something that has been discussed yesterday, and it seems like now there's a greater awareness of this variation since the database has become available for general consumption, and it's raised a bunch of interesting questions about how individual differences relate to kind of normative naming in a population. And that's something that we're going to look at today. Okay, so I just want to acknowledge the shift kind of in the point of view that's out there, which is basically that recently there's been a shift that these color salience-based explanations, which have really dominated kind of the psychophysical studies done by Boyton and colleagues of color categorization types of behaviors, have been shifted over now to an idea of maybe interpoint distance models being important to model the partitioning of color space and the application of lexical labels. Okay, so how do simulation studies further inform us about human color categorization research? Well, that's been a topic of very recent research, and in fact, I just want to note that prior to 2005, I'm not really aware of a whole lot of other simulation research that looked into trying to understand how color categories are formed and learned in societies of individuals, be them agents or real human beings. I mean, maybe Luke, you know of some previous study, but I think that your work with Tony Belpime was one of the earliest types of simulation studies that looked at this. And these different types of research efforts, many of them draw on evolutionary game theory, just as we have. Some of them use different kinds of approaches, different types of simulation approaches in different games. And to varying degrees, they look at adopting perceptual models versus not adopting perceptual models. So there's starting to be a range of exposure with regard to simulated category learning in these artificial populations. Our recent work has appeared in the Journal of Mass Psych and is currently under review at another journal and in progress. And I just want to emphasize right off that we do not consider in any way our investigations to be a kind of a description of what's going on in the human color categorization literature. What we see it as is a way to complement that literature and to help us kind of test different types of parameters kind of objectively to find out, as a proof of concept, what's possible in terms of evolving color category systems and what is not possible, and then to go out and test as to whether or not that's what we see in human populations. Okay, so I just want to raise two possible kind of questions or topics of interest that Natalia is going to expand upon with some of our results from our simulation work. And the first one is, what happens with signaling systems under observer heterogeneity? This has come up in the last day or two, and the reason it's important is because if you think about color naming and color categorization systems, they have a practical communication value, which is they're designed so that individuals can basically talk about things that are colorful and important in their environment. And in a homogeneous a population where you have observers that all have the same shared visual capacities, and the capacity involves this ability to tell this Brayburn apple from this Granny Smith apple, that's one type of possible simulation scenario that can be looked at with a homogeneous population. But if you try to think about introducing individual variation into your observer in these simulation studies, then you run into a case where you might have an agent that is color deficient or modeled as color deficient, where they don't have the capability to distinguish this Brayburn apple from the Granny Smith apple, and they don't have the ability to communicate with their cohorts in the population about this particular issue, if it should be important. So this is why it's an interesting question from the point of view of color categorization and communication about color, and we know this to be the case because of the perceptual basis of color deficiency and the different sensitivities you get for the different deficiencies that you see in human populations. Okay. And the consequence of this has real-world impact, as you saw with the apples, because in the case of these two color deficient individuals right here, who are common in some populations, you have an inability to pick out these red blossoms, perhaps, in some of these cases. Okay, so communication about these flowers, if they were an important food source or an important social item, would be dealt with somewhat differently in a population where heterogeneity existed. Okay. Now, it's important to point out that these types of variations in color perception are X chromosome linked, and for that reason, and they do vary across different groups of racial ancestry across the world. So when we look at these corpuses like the World Color Survey that tests a wide range of populations across the globe, or we concentrate on the Mesoamerican survey or any other survey that's been done, we have to consider that there's going to be different variation in the frequency of this type of variability in the populations. Whether that's going to be important or not, whether it's significant enough, is an interesting empirical question, and one that we hope to model.
Julie?
Yeah.
That previous slide, I think a real striking feature is that there are big differences, like in the first three, in the percentage of males, but hardly any difference in the percentage of females. Is there a genetic reason for that?
I don't know. I'll have to think about that. That's a really interesting question. I haven't observed that before. I don't know. I have to think about that. So, yeah. Okay. If you have individual variation in the population, what are some possible consequences from the point of view of doing a task like the kind that is done in the World Color Survey or all other types of categorization tasks like this? I'm not saying that this is what happens in the World Color Survey. I'm saying what are some possible consequences that might occur in naming given individual variation. We can do a little thought experiment. So if you ask some individuals to look at this grid and name each chip in isolations, you can get a list of terms that are used in the population that kind of give you the set of color terms that exist in that population. And then you can do things like you take this grid and you can ask individuals to give you all the examples of these different glosses here, yellow, green, blue, and red, and they will give you some individual choices, some possible, choices. There might be some variation because they don't agree with themselves all the time, or they think there's better examples. And these could be best examples, or they might just be category exemplars, depending upon the denotative ranges of the terms that you're coming up with. But as you increase and look at group aggregates, you of course get these variations adding somewhat, and this is probably exaggerated. Like I said, it's a cartoon, but you definitely are going to get more variation when you look at different individuals for the reasons that we saw in those grids earlier. And across languages, in theory at least, it seems like you might find, especially when there's translation differences between terms, that these contours for these examples, these denotative ranges, actually increase a considerable amount. This is just one possible way of thinking about how individual variation might factor in to this kind of measured behavior. And it's this sort of observer variation that our simulation investigations can help clarify. Okay. The second issue that I want to just bring up quickly before I turn it over to Natalia is that color category systems are formed in some cases in the context of stimulus heterogeneity. Not population heterogeneity now, but stimulus heterogeneity. What I'm talking about is cases where you have color serving a specific function in the environment or in the society that you're dealing with. In the case of this dusky TT New World primate I showed you here eating a mango, that rich green, that rich orange color of the mango that you see could signal a calorie-rich food source, and there's been a certain amount of debate whether the opsons that are evolved in primates are evolved in such a way as to be able to detect ripe fruit or tender leaves as a food source. So there's one possible non-uniformity in the stimulus space that may come into play. And the question arises is how do different environmental settings, of which there are many in the World Color Survey and across the some other surveys that have been done in the literature, how do these differences in terms of environmental color frequency and the utility of color in those environments impact color categorization? Those are also questions that can be examined using the simulated color category learning that we are looking at today. Okay, so in terms of the simulation studies, we ask a couple of important questions. First, we simply ask, what is the minimum that one needs to evolve a color categorization system? We start very simply. We try not to start with any built-in kinds of observer models, okay? And secondly, how do two or more factors which simultaneously influence color naming behaviors trade off when they enter in together in the process of developing a stable system? The other important difference is we start by assuming very little about the phenomenon at all levels of observer features, environmental stimulus, social pragmatic influences on color signaling systems. And in particular, as I said, we do not incorporate a color perception model into our agents, okay? We assume only that individual agents can detect differences in stimulus continua. Secondly, that continuous stimulus domains are approximated by discrete samples that individuals can evaluate in discrimination games. That there's some need for categorization in the society of agents that we're looking at, and that two agents can engage in a communication game with minimal pragmatic communication features assumed. Okay, the categorization domain that we look at is the subspace of the three-dimensional color apparent solid that I showed you a little bit earlier, namely a continuous Hue circle. We start with this because it is actually one of the more sensible dimensional reductions of color space you can look at from a formal point of view, okay? And just to give the final warm-up for Natasha, you know that from the talks that color space dimensions are involved this achromatic kind of lightness axis that runs through the interior of the color appearance solid, and that the richness of color increases as you move from this neutral white point out to the perimeter of the solid. And then, of course, the Hue circle, which is what we're going to be looking at, is this this perimeter around the central portion of the solid. Okay. We sample that continuum, and we string it out into a n-chip long array for the purposes of presenting our plots, and this helps us relate it to the existing cross-cultural stimulus. And I just want to say that although we're relating it to the existing cross-cultural stimulus, we don't have any assumptions about that relationship reflecting an actual model for what humans are doing. Now I'm going to turn it over to Natalia.
Okay, so I present the numerical part of this project, and we start from simplification. It's difficult to do computations in a three-dimensional space of colors. So the first simplification is we take this color solid, take the skin, and take the Hue circle, just one strip, the equator of the circle, and that's going to be our color space. It's a simplification, but it's a start. This project is devoted to categorization. So the first and the most basic question is, given a continuum of colors, for instance, a color circle, how do humans split it into a finite number of categories? And this is the first thing we will address here. And later on, I'll talk about the two things that Kimberley described, the heterogeneity of a population and heterogeneity of a color space. But we start from the simplest system where everybody is the same. and we just have this uniform continuum of colors. A mathematical definition of a categorization will differ a little bit from other modelers that have done this. So we envisage a table like this. So these are all the colors. These are all the color chips, so to say. And each column represents probabilities to call each color term. So these could be red, orange, yellow, green, blue, circle, purple, but they don't have to be. A, B, C, D is fine. So, for example, this first column, a particular individual or an agent has 10% probability to call this F, 20% probability to call it E, 50% probability to call it D. Okay, so in this particular case, he can use different colors with different probabilities to describe the same chip. Or it could be deterministic, like in the second column here. This person calls this chip E 100% of the time. Okay, so this framework gives me flexibility. I could have a deterministic or a probabilistic color categorization. And as we will see, for normal individuals, categorizations are usually deterministic. But the probabilistic ones will enter when we expand the type of viewers or agents that we have. So, and we introduce some basis for categorization, which is entirely pragmatic in this approach. We assume that objects of similar colors are likely to have similar properties, and objects of different colors are likely to have different properties. For instance, I give you an apple, and I ask you, please go to that tree and bring me an apple of the same color. You go to the tree, and the chances are that none of the apples are exactly the same color as this, because we have a color continuum. Each apple is slightly different. So what do you qualify as the same color? And what is different? So somehow this kind of an apple is similar to the one I showed you, and this one is different. So practically speaking, you want to classify this apple in the same category as the one I gave you, and this is different. Okay, this is a simple idea of similar or different. And so the correct choice would be this apple, okay? And we just say that it is useful to call similar colors the same name, and it is also useful to call faraway colors different names. One more useful thing. It is also useful to be able to communicate with others. So these three components comprise our model. And I'll start with the first two and then add communication. So we describe the individual discrimination game. Just one agent, he is in isolation. He does not yet talk to others. And the game proceeds as follows. This is after Luke Steele's model, slightly modified. So two color chips are picked from a distribution. And the agent probabilistically assigns color categories. So he looks up that table, which is his current categorization, and he says, okay, he flips a coin, and he assigns color names to the two chips. And there are four outcomes. So if the given chips are nearby, and he called them the same category, then we'll consider the game a success. And if he thought they're nearby and he thought that they're different color names, that's a failure. However, if the initial chips were far apart and he thought they were the same color, it's a failure. And if they're far apart and he called them different names, that's a success. Okay. So now we have to quantify what is far apart. Far apart. See, nearby and far apart. It's wishy-washy. We have to put a number to that. And this number is called KSimilarity. This is the only parameter of the model that we have. And this quantifies what it means to be close together or far apart. It introduces a scale in the model. So I have a verbal description of KSimilarity. It's the minimum difference between the color chips for which it becomes important to treat them for pragmatic purposes as different color categories. Again, so the color chips that are within KSimilarity, like these two, can be very well distinguished by an individual. This KSimilarity parameter is not similar to J and D, just noticeable difference. So they can be visually distinguished. It just so happens that two apples if they're this shade and this shade of red have the same properties, something like this.
Excuse me, clarification. You're assuming the same window size for the entire spectrum.
For now. So this is a uniform
Right.
input space, and this will be this uniformity will be removed in the end of the talk. For success, I need to put these two chips in different categories, and these two have to be the same category to have a successful game. Okay, so we can define the success rate of this game. We play a number of games and count how many successes we have, and in the limit we have the success rate. So now the old idea of Kimberley's that human color categorization should optimize, so it should be optimal in some sense. Now we give it a numerical value. The optimal categorization is the one that maximizes the probability of success of those games that I described. So we have a well-defined quantity. Let's find a categorization that maximizes the success rate of these games. Okay. So the corresponding color categorization can be found theoretically without the aid of computers in the simplest case, and I'll talk about that. And for more complicated cases, we'll use computer simulations. So in the simplest case, where the color space is uniform and the optimal categorization looks like this. So let's suppose we have 3 color categories, and these are 2 examples of color categorization that we obtain. And these are the results. The optimal categorization is deterministic. So never will a person use 2 color terms to describe the same chip if they want to have an optimal categorization. Okay, so you'd think that this whole probabilistic approach is useless, but it will come useful later. Now, categories have equal sizes, and each category is a connected set of chips. So you can't say, like, there's a little bit of red here and a little bit of red here. They're always connected. We can calculate the optimal number of color categories. So it's uniquely defined by the KSimilarity parameter that I introduced. The categorization, optimal categorization is rotationally invariant. What does that mean? So if we have 4 categories, this is an example of an optimal categorization, and so is this, and so is this. You rotate the boundaries, and they're all as good as each other. Another thing is that the success rate can never be 1 in these games, because whenever you have a color border, the two chips next to it are nearby, but nonetheless they belong to different categories. So when we optimize the success rate, it's never perfect, but you can find a maximum. So now those results are analytical. I didn't have to use computers for that. But we have to design a computer, like evolutionary type algorithm, to explore more difficult situations when we have heterogeneity. So we want to introduce some sort of evolutionary dynamics, which will bring the system to an optimal categorization. So we suppose that the player starts from a random categorization, assign those random numbers to that matrix. And the rounds of the discrimination game are played. In case of success, the category is strengthened, and in case of failure, it's weakened. So I don't know if it's of any interest to anybody. So I use a particular type of learner, and we have used several different ones. So here is what we call the reinforcement learner. So each color chip is equipped with some memory stacks. We have a certain memory for to call it. So you have only 2 colors, light and dark. So we have 25% light and 75% dark. Okay. Pick 2 chips at random. Suppose these are chips 1 and 2, and have him flip a coin and assign categories to them. Let's suppose he assigned dark to chip 1 and light to chip 2. So that's a failure, right? Because the chips are nearby, but he called them different colors. So we have to update his memory such that he doesn't do it again, or he's less likely to do this again. So we have to lower this category and this category because they led to failure. So in the next iteration, the stacks are updated accordingly. And now we can play this game, and this is a particular realization of the game. Again, it's still one person, one agent playing. On the x-axis are all the color chips, and the y-axis tells you the probability to use each color term. There are 4 functions plotted here simultaneously, so it looks kind of random at first. And in the end, after many rounds of this game, he arrives at the categorization that looks like this. I blow it up. So chips from here to here are always called this color with probability 1. These chips with probability 1 are called the different color, and so on. So this is what an optimal categorization, or nearly optimal categorization, looks like. You can see that at the color borders, there's always some noise, okay, because this is a numerical result. Another way to represent the same thing is, so this is a random categorization. Here, each chip has many colors associated with this, the length of the bar being proportional to the probability to use each color for that chip. And eventually you get something like this. So, for instance, this chip is always green, right? Okay, so now we have to add communication. So we put many agents together. And the game proceeds as following. We pick 2 individuals at random, no network here, just mixing, perfect mixing. Pick 2 individuals at random, and they play the discrimination game, as described before. If one is successful and the other one is not, then the successful one teaches the unsuccessful one. If both are successful, we can pick one of them to be a teacher. It can be done at random, or we can take account of their previous successes. It doesn't make a difference here. And if both fail, they just use the unsuccessful update from the discrimination game. And let's look at the population results. So now the results are more difficult to visualize. So we start round 1 with a number of agents. 3 of them are represented here. And they all have a random categorization of chips. And after a while, you can see that they all converge to something that looks very similar. And moreover, it looks nearly optimal. So here I use a different way to plot it. Again, the horizontal axis is all the chips. And the vertical axis is the preferred color for that chip. So there are no probabilities here. So this guy calls all these chips color 3. All these are color 1, 2, 3. So the whole population converged to a nearly optimal categorization, which is shared among the agents. A general question is, how do we summarize this picture? So we have a bunch of people who have certain probabilities to name colors. How do we represent this as one graph? And this problem, in fact, turns out to be similar to a voting problem. So each person has, for each color chip, each person in the population has a preference. For instance, his favorite color to use for this chip is red, but sometimes he uses orange. And even more, less often he uses yellow. How do you incorporate information of this sort for each population member to represent the whole population picture? So basically, what is the most popular color that is used by the population for each chip? And we use some results that come from voting theories, which are described here. And there are 2 particular cases, is a plurality vote and border count. Basically, plurality vote, we only count, so if somebody uses red 60% of the time for this chip, we say that his favorite color is red, and then we average out in the whole population. Border count is more sensitive to the second choices. So you have to think about presidential elections and how this is done. So in different countries, actually, it's done differently. And some countries do use border count, where they consider secondary preferences and even tertiary third preferences of people. In any case, we can show that no matter what score you use, it's going to be the same at the steady state. So here we show the winning category for all the color chips, calculated according to plurality score and border count. And you can see that all the numbers are different. And in the end, after 100,000 runs, you can see that the 2 strings almost coincide. And you can also see that this is a region where everybody, all the chips are called number 4, 1, 3. So this is a nearly optimal categorization, and you can prove that near optimum, various types of counts, like plurality count and border count, give you the same result. Okay, so it doesn't matter how you do it; the result is going to be the same. Now, returning to populations of individuals, we can show that after a number of runs, the population converges to a consensus. The population solution looks nearly optimal. And you can also plot things like degree of agreement, which is quite high in populations. So now I want to say a few words about the central result of this preliminary study, which is rotational invariance. I told you that, say, if we have a 4-category solution, color boundaries can be anywhere. They could be like this, or it could be the same solution rotated by any number of color chips. Okay, so a rotation of this will give you another optimal solution. And one way to represent this is like this. Let's make a huge number of simulations and record. So each simulation starts from a random categorization and stops when the population converges to a consensus. And then we record which chip corresponds to a color boundary. Okay? So, and this is a diagram. So these are all the chips, and this is how often they happen to be at the boundary. And you can see that it's pretty much uniform for 5-category, 6-category, 4-category solutions. So a color boundary can occur anywhere in the space of colors.
4-category doesn't work.
You just have to do it more.
I see.
Yeah. So my analogy is the Wheel of Fortune. So everybody knows what that is. It's this big symmetrical object that you spin, and let's suppose there are numbers, say from 1 to 100 over here. We spin it, and we wait until it stops, and we record what number is at the very bottom, okay? And we plot a diagram of that. And of course, every number has the same chance to end up at the bottom because it's a symmetrical wheel, okay? So we have a diagram like this, and it looks very similar to these things, okay? So, and we will return to the Wheel of Fortune, but when it becomes less symmetrical later on. So far we have shown that the homogeneous population of agents converges to a common, nearly optimal color categorization. And the homogeneous color space is split in a predictable number of equal color categories. And the solution is defined up to an arbitrary rotation. Okay. Now we want to add inhomogeneities in the space and see how this affects the solution. And as Kimberley said, there are going to be 2 types of inhomogeneities. One is population inhomogeneity, and the other one is color space. So first, we add dichromats in the population. Dichromats is a general term, and it's probably not correct. There are all sorts of people who have different color vision than normal, so we just call them dichromats. By looking at these pictures, you can tell whether you're a dichromat or not. What dichromats do is they have a different color representation space. So let's suppose that this is my Hue circle that I start with. And colorblind people commonly tend to confuse red and green. So somehow their space doesn't look like a circle, but the red and the green parts of the circle get collapsed onto each other, so as if it's the same. Okay? And the way to model is to collapse this onto various objects like this. This is the minimal collapse. We just take 1 point here and 1 point here and put them together, get an number 8 shape. Or we can take this and collapse them. Or we can take the whole circle and squish it down to a line. Okay, this is the most extreme case of dichromats. So they don't distinguish the upper part of this circle and the lower part. So they have a different color representation space. We call it a psychophysical transformation. It takes chips in the physical space of stimuli, and it converts it to another object in the perceptual space of agents. And this complicated-looking formula is nothing but this type of transformation. We take a circle, we always start with a circle, and it can be converted to something like this or like this or like this in the most extreme case. Okay, so L is the number, I think is the number of chips that are collapsed onto each other. L varies from 1 to n over 2 minus 1 or so. Okay, and so by necessity, the colors, the categorization of a dichromat looks symmetrical because, you know, certain parts of the color space are identical to each other. Okay. So now we put a few of those dichromat agents in the population. So each agent performs a couple of things. First, when he receives the pair of stimuli, the pair of chips to play discrimination game, he converts them onto his psychophysical space, his perceptual space. And a dichromat will see, for instance, a green and a red chip as the same. Okay, he can't tell the difference. And after that, they play the game, the same game as before. And we run the population, and of course, now we cannot do anything analytically. We have to do computer simulations. That's why we developed this whole machinery. So we look at the population solutions. And this is a typical population solution in the presence of dichromats. Here, out of 100 people, there are 2 dichromats, and you don't see any difference, right? Qualitatively, it looks the same. The space is split into intervals. Each of them is called a different color. And there's a high degree of agreement in the population, so it's the same kind of thing. However, there is a subtle difference. So let's trace the boundaries, as before, of the colors. And again, we'll look at 4 category, 5 category, and 6 category solutions. I remind you what we had before. We record the position of the boundary and perform the experiment many times. And before, there was a uniform distribution of where the boundaries are going to occur. That's when there are no dichromats in the population. I'm going to add dichromats, so 1%, 2%, up to 10%. And you can see, especially here, that the distribution changes drastically. Now the boundaries of colors are fixed. Okay? Look at the Wheel of Fortune. We spin it, and the chip that ends up at the bottom is random. It could be anyone. Now let me put a weight on the Wheel of Fortune, something heavy, a heavy object. Now every time you spin the wheel, it's probably this chip that's going to be at the bottom. So the distribution from uniform becomes very sharp, right? It's because I broke the symmetry, the rotational symmetry of the wheel. And now it's forced to always stop at the same place. And this is exactly what happens here by adding dichromats to the population, even a small percentage of them, 1% here. You can see that there is a statistical change in the probability distribution of color boundaries. So, if there are only normal people in the population, any of these will be a solution. Add a few dichromats, and only this optimal solution is allowed now. Or say it's preferred. It happens more often in a simulation than any of these. So somehow the presence of dichromats anchors color boundaries. And of course, symmetry breaking comes from this asymmetrical representation space of the dichromats. They have a confusion axis. Remember the circle that we collapse. So this defines the direction, the preferred direction in the color space. And that's what fixes the position of the boundaries. An interesting result is we can compare this kind of dichromats, where only 1 chip is collapsed, with this type where like most of the circle is collapsed. And with 10% of them, we can see that the boundaries are anchored but at different locations. So we can say that the axis of non-confusion attracts and the axis of confusion repels color boundaries. So we derive all sorts of laws like this. Yeah?
So if the population was inside your dichromats, then the optimal solution would be the one that emerges?
The optimal solution will be different, actually. It will be some equipartitioning of the dichromatic space, not the circle, right? Yeah. But it's a good question how the number of dichromats influences the population solution. And you can see that up to at least 10 or 20%, the solution is still very close to optimal. However, if you increase the number of dichromats beyond about 20%, and I haven't done a systematic study of this, it breaks down, and there's also the degree of agreement in the population goes down dramatically, and so things just don't work. However, such high percentages of dichromats is not a realistic model, so we kind of didn't look much.
But it's, I mean, so it is 100%.
Of dichromats?
Then you do have everybody agreeing on the nature of the
I
space.
think so. I think you will, but it'll be some equipartitioning of this
Of that funny-looking.
funny-looking space, exactly. Oh, and here, the presence of dichromats also changes the number of color categories. So we increase the percentage of dichromats, and the frequency of 5-category solution in this particular set of parameters goes down. 4-category solution becomes more prevalent, and you can explain all these.
Do the presence of dichromats affect the convergence rate, speed of convergence?
Not noticeably. I didn't do a systematic study, but not noticeably so. Yeah. And we don't pay too much attention to convergence rates here because they are so model dependent that it's not really realistic to even. Okay, so part 2 is to break down the symmetry in a different way. Now we look at the only normal individuals, no dichromats, but we introduce some inhomogeneity in the color space. Okay, and the way we do it is before we said that KSimilarity, this parameter that defines how close similar colors are, it's not a constant anymore, but it can vary across the space. The simplest function that we could design is that it's small somewhere and large elsewhere. Okay, we have a spot where KSimilarity is smaller than in the rest of the space. What does it mean? It means that there is a special region in the spectrum or in the Hue circle where it's very important to distinguish shades that are kind of close nearby. Okay, so for instance, it could be red, and if a certain shade of red is signals for nutritious food, and a different shade of red signals for poisonous fruit, it would be good to put these two in different categories, even though they're nearby. Okay, this is not a realistic example. It's just an explanation of what this might mean. We call this a region of increased salience, and it's a particular form of a non-homogeneous K-similarity function. We can do other things, but we investigated this in detail. So now, what happens to a population solution in the presence of a region of increased salience? Well, you can see that here we have 3 narrow color categories within the region of increased salience, and larger categories outside that region. So this is another way to see this. This is a Hue circle. This is a region of increased salience, and we have this kind of solution. So the size of categories is affected by the presence of the region of increased salience. But of course, also we have the presence of the region of increased salience fixes the boundaries, because those small categories have to be on top of the region of increased salience. So there is no rotation anymore. It breaks the rotation in the most trivial fashion, and this is one of those diagrams. Remember, if there is rotational symmetry, it looks uniform, and here we have color boundaries, so it's very well-defined spots. So this is a 5-category solution, 6-category solution, and that's what they look like, and they are not rotationally invariant anymore. So to summarize the region of increased salience, for homogeneous populations, this region removes solution the rotational invariance. The categories are refined inside this region, and also the number of categories in the solution can vary. Now, let's put the 2 results together. We have an inhomogeneity in the K-similarity measure, regions of increased salience, and we have inhomogeneity in the population, the presence of dichromats. What do? They both do the same things. They both remove rotational invariance, and they both change the category number and size in a different way. So they do achieve those things by very different mechanisms. So non-homogeneous stimulus space aligns color boundaries with that special region okay? And it changes the number and size by putting smaller categories inside that region. The presence of dichromats removes rotational invariance by aligning the category boundaries with the ambiguity axis. We talk about this collapse of the space, visual space, the stimulus space onto the psychophysical space of dichromats. And it changes category number and sizes according to the non-ambiguous axis orientation. So again, it's a different mechanism. And so it's interesting that to see what happens if we put both together in the model. Okay, so we consider a population of normals and dichromats, and we also include the region of increased salience in the population. So here, let's start with normals only. This is the region of increased salience, and the normals arrive at a solution like this, where there are smaller categories on top of the region of increased salience. And now I want to add a few dichromats in the population. So dichromats, let's suppose these are the most extreme dichromats that just collapse the two halves of the circle together to make a line. Okay, that defines the axis of no confusion. You see blue and yellow are the colors that are not confused. That's this axis. And we have shown before, and I didn't emphasize this in the first part of my talk. So what happens is in the presence of dichromats, this axis tends to repel color boundaries. Solutions don't like to have a color boundary at the same point where this axis crosses the circle. So this is not a good solution from the point of view of dichromats. Okay, so something has to be done. So the solution gets distorted. If this point, this color boundary actually shifts this way, this one shifts this way, and some of these categories extend such that the axis of no confusion lies kind of inside color domains, and it doesn't overlap with the color boundary. Okay, so you can see that the presence of dichromats introduces this further transformation of the optimal solution. So now the solution that we obtain is a compromise between the presence of this region of increased salience and the presence of dichromats. So we can see that the two types of inhomogeneity interact in an interesting way to break the rotational symmetry of the solution and to refine categories and place them in a non-trivial way. So to conclude this part of the talk, I can say that for a uniform color space and a homogeneous population of viewers, the categorization is rotational invariant, and it's an equipartitioning of a circle. In the presence of inhomogeneities in the color space or in the population, the color boundaries are fixed and color categories may have different size. Now, dichromats align the color categories along the non-ambiguous axis, and the inhomogeneities in the color space decrease category size inside the region of increased salience. Different populations may have different regions of increased salience. That depends on their lifestyle, habits, environment, and so on, and different types of color vision variability. So as Kimberley suggested, various populations, for instance, have different percentages of dichromats, European descent being the highest percentage. So our theory has the potential to explain the observed variation in color categorization. And at this point, I invite Kimberley back to talk more about implications of this.
So following up on the report of the results, I just want to touch upon quickly a few issues that are relevant from the literature and relate some of our results to the literature to say how they bear on what's been found in the empirical study of human color categorization, always with the caveat that we're modeling agents, not humans, but the methods may be useful and informative for looking at proof of concept trade-offs in the human populations. So these are the 4 items I might be able to get through. I'll start by just talking about category solutions based on similarity and asking the question of how do observers use similarity to categorize color. We can understand this a little bit better if we start to unpack the color similarity dynamics that go on when I ask a subject, for example, to pick a good example of green from a Hue circle like the one that we used in our particular experiments. And so here we have this hue continuum that's just ranging from yellow to blue. And, you know, in the Hue Circle, they, of course, have these fuzzy boundaries from the point of view of the empirical data as well as from the point of view of the formalization in our model. And it may be the case when I ask an individual to choose color best exemplars, they adopt the strategy of picking the appearance that's furthest from the blue boundary as well as furthest from the yellow boundary. So they have this type of kind of repelling action at the boundaries, so that best category exemplars might tend towards some midpoint between categories. I'm not saying this is empirically what occurs in the data. I'm saying this could be an analog for the dynamic that goes on in choosing color best exemplars based on similarity. Okay. Now, if I ask subjects to do a different kind of task, which is show me all the greens in this array, so basically give me the category denotative range as opposed to picking out some best exemplar, subject might adopt the strategy, well, I'm going to pick all the appearances that are most similar to some best exemplar point, while also not too similar to neighboring category exemplars. So you have this kind of effect where you get some definition of category ranges defined based on some kind of idealized notion of what green represents in the mind of that individual. And this construct of a central exemplar, which all category members should ideally resemble, is something that attracts or anchors the boundaries as well when you talk about the denotative ranges of these boundaries. So in terms of these dynamics, what happens if for normal observers within an ethnolinguistic group, the basis for this similarity-based idea of best exemplar varies? Well, it could be the case that you have three individuals that have three different ideas in their mind about this notion of picking a good example of the category, okay? And it actually turns out that there might be some empirical basis for this found in the psychophysical data, because we know that perception varies even in normal observer groups, and that ranges of individual color perception differences are greater than have been acknowledged in the color cognition and categorization literature. Partly for practical purposes, I would add, just to qualify that it's a difficult task to do this when you're collecting data in the field and whatnot. And it may be the case that the extent of these ranges raises questions about the idea of a uniformly shared perceptual color space as the explanation for color category uniformity across individuals. I know that's not the direction that the optimality approaches are leaning, but I think it's very clear in the literature that there's still a strong emphasis of this in even some of the simulation data that's been present in the literature recently, and there's certainly a strong emphasis of it in the empirical literature done by a number of different research labs. So as an example, we should just talk about what the psychophysical results are for individuals choosing colors where you're basically selecting an exemplar from a category which is uniquely belonging to that category. So it has no other membership to any other categories from a perceptual point of view. And the idea is that if I set you up in an experiment, a psychophysical experiment, and I have you look through a little single eyepiece, and I set up a set of primaries that you can mix, a pure single wavelength blue primary and a pure single wavelength yellow primary, and I have you mix those in one half of the visual field. So you have a circle and you have one half with a mixture, and in the other half I have a fixed single wavelength green light. The idea would be that you could achieve a green that would be perfectly balanced in yellow and blue, and it would match the unique green appearance that you see in the other field. And that you can get a setting for what those positions are, and you see that when you have normal variation in the population for these types of settings, it's rather large. For this data set in particular, this is one of the larger ranges you see in the data. In particular, this is a span of 60 nanometers for these types of settings, and that's a rather considerable difference, considering that there's only a 30 nanometer difference between a pure red and a pure green appearance. Okay, so the point is that you have this kind of variation in these pure percepts. What's the implication mean for doing kind of categorization across individuals where this type of variation exists? okay? Here's another example of this data. If you didn't like that other data set, this is actually data from 10 different studies using different types of procedures, including ones with one-cell chips, like the ones that are used in the color categorization research, and done by a whole range of experimentalists like Nerger and Webster and very acknowledged people in the area. And the basic point is that you have these large variations across individuals, even though if you look at the average settings, you get kind of some nice kind of average data, okay? All right. So in terms of color similarity, what happens if for normal observers within an ethnolinguistic group, the basis for the similarity-based idea of best exemplar varies? Well, it could be the case that the structure of individual color similarity also varies, and that there's possible consequences for population category solutions. One possible consequence is that there's no effect on category solutions, and the other one is that there's some yet unknown consequence because it hasn't been studied. And what I want to say is this possible unknown consequence of this variation on population category solutions, at a minimum, seems that something else may be helping along systems that begin with perceptual constraints in achieving the goal of a shared color signaling system. So the idea is that we've shown that you have these important symmetry breaking and anchoring types of effects that occur due to things like an axis of confusion and dichromacy, or an important region in the environment, in the region of increased salience. And so the idea would be that the perceptual model that you would have built in to develop to an individual who is sharing color categories would also present a constraint and would trade off with these other types of things that are helping along developing a system for categorization. I want to suggest that one of the things that's helping along the shared nature of color signaling is related to human communication pragmatics, namely the idea of linguistic charity. And linguistic charity is originally due to Putnam and was related to a concept by Freud called shareability, but we discuss it in some of our work over the years. And basically it's the idea that when we're in a conversation about color for the sake of communication, I will allow you to commit a certain amount of inaccuracy in your communications for the sake of being able to carry out a discourse. And ideally, this kind of thing will work both ways in a population where linguistic charity is considered a sensible social practice. Okay. So, as an example, calling a color by the name of an adjacent near category, or even simply an adjacent category that's not the nearest category to where this chip appears in the color circle, is permissible and accommodated by some kind of social interaction. And analytically, this can be shown as a decreasing imposition on discourse as the number of categories that are shared in a society increases. So basically, for systems with more categories, a categorization error is not as dramatic of an error as it is in a system with just a few categories, because there's a potential for a lot of confusion, there's a lot of categories, there's a lot of ways to name things incorrectly, and therefore linguistic charity is a more reinforced social practice. Okay. All right. So that's one possible way that we think a constraint of communication in human populations could perhaps be modeled by simulation studies and trade off with the kinds of constraints that have already been presented on perceptual modeling as well as environment. Okay. If we look at differences in category solutions that arise from homogeneous and heterogeneous populations, we can think also and draw a parallel also to the work that was presented, some of the work by Luke Steels earlier today on his Behavioral and Brain piece with Tony Belpime that appeared recently. And in this particular commentary, which you saw was an agent-based evolution of color terms in homogeneous agent populations, I raised the suggestion that the possibility exists that in heterogeneous populations, category distinctions may be influenced by a need to disambiguate the communication of categories among variant observer types. And the variant observer types could be something like the ones that Natasha talked about, with the idea that you would have ambiguous axes and non-ambiguous axes, and the groups in discussions with normals and dichromats would find a way to disambiguate the confusions that might arise in pairwise discourses. Okay. In response to the comment, Steels and Belpime did an extra simulation. They modeled heterogeneity with the idea that in heterogeneous populations, each individual can have a random variation on color perception that is implemented as a normal variation with a standard deviation of 10 on each of the different dimensions of the space. So they took the agent model that they had in terms of the CIE-LAB space, and they did a random variation of each observer's profile on that space, introducing heterogeneity into their agent populations. And they considered that the average communicated success of 5 populations consisting of identical agents versus the average success of 5 populations consisting of agents having variation in their chromatic perception, with each population having 20 agents. And the result they found is the following, which is that if you have homogeneous populations represented by a solid line, and you have the result of communicative success for heterogeneous populations with this random fluctuation by this this hatched line here, you'll notice that as the gains increase to 100,000, you get kind of a asymptote, and there's very similar types of behavior for the 2 populations in their simulation in terms of communicative success. Okay, and based on this, they say the communicative success of both kinds of agents evolves in the same way, showing that perceptual variations have very little influence on communication of color. But I would just like to suggest that there's 3 ways that you can model individual variation of this source, and you might have 3 different expectations based upon different kinds of models. One way to do it is due to the way that was done by Steels and Belpime, that is just introduce random interaction or random differences in the color space in your agents and see how that affects your solutions, or to introduce some kind of systematic observer variation of the form of the kind that we did with the anchor of non-confusion present in our populations, uniformly present, kind of consistent with the idea that you have types like a deuteranope and a protanope, okay? And that you can try to do this at realistic types of levels from the point of view that you have normal subjects as well with slight variations. So you have anomalous trichromats as well. So you can have these strong anchors of non-confusion present in the population, and you can have just normal agents with slight variations, the basis of slight tuning of photopigments, okay? And you can also do what we did with the confusion axis symmetry breaking. The point of this is the point of these 3 different suggestions is that you might expect 3 different outcomes to arise from these 3 different models. You might expect that random variation just introduces not any kind of systematicity in the way that the categories would be further constrained. So you might not be surprised to get the result that you see in the Steels and Belpime graph that I showed you earlier. But if you did something more akin to what we did in our simulation studies, presenting a strong anchor with an axis of confusion, here's a case where heterogeneity might cause an important result, as we showed, and it might also be the case in your simulations. And something in between may give you some kind of blend of the results that we separately saw. Okay, so I think this underscores, especially the previous example I gave, the importance of considering cognitive processes as a constraint as well on these the perceptual constraints that are obviously imposed by the CIE model that's used when we try to understand what the data is telling us, and that when individual differences exist, because of these things like linguistic charity, in the case of dichromats and anomalous subjects, language can gloss differences that permit meaningful communication, and that you may have some kind of normative linking function in between the representations, or a naming function in between the representations to help this along. And this is one way to possibly model it. And the point is that because people see color even when their language contains no words for color itself, clearly some mental representation exists for the color words, and the lack of perception does not exclude participation in shared linguistic knowledge. So the suggestion is towards a more comprehensive view of the trade-off between the different types of factors that would be influencing these categorization solutions that we come up with. And there is some empirical evidence to support this idea that I've suggested. Basically, if we have our three kinds of observers that we've discussed, and they have these confusion and non-confusion types of profiles, then we can talk about how similarity for colors in different kinds of observers, cognitive similarity from triad types of studies, map out differently for names versus colors. And this experiment was actually done by Roger Shepard and Lynn Cooper. It was also done earlier by Mariam Moore and Jameson and Hurvich. But the point about this study, in case you're not familiar with it, many of you probably are, is that if you give normal color vision individuals a similarity task where they have 3 stimuli and they have to select the odd one out, okay, so it's triad similarity. And you first test odd man out type of task for names, where you have all the possible triadic comparisons between these 9 color samples: green, turquoise, blue, violet, purple, red, orange, and gold, okay? Then you can scale those similarity distances using a multidimensional scaling type of procedure, and you get this nice kind of circular structure, relational structure among those terms for normal subjects when you have them do the similarity between the words only, okay? If you have them scale actual physical color samples, so a chip that's green, a chip that's turquoise, and so on and so forth, you get a very similar kind of structure for colors only. So this is nice because this tells us, as Shepard emphasizes, that there is this second-order isomorphism present between the representation for colors and the representation for color categories or color words, okay? Now, if you look at the same kind of task in a dichromat subject and have them look at their similarity space, you'll note that when you have them do the perceptual task of doing the similarity between colors, you have this collapsing, so they're not able to do the distinguishing as is how we've modeled it in our particular agent models. They collapse this axis where red and green are. Okay. But interestingly enough, they preserve the same ordering in the names and the categorical concepts of these 5 color terms here. So in a sense, from the point of view of the names, you cannot tell the difference between a dichromat and a trichromat model. So here's a case where you have perceptually different observers, right? They have different perceptual spaces, and they're perfectly able to share in a color naming communication system from the point of view of knowing what its structural relations are among the terms that are used and among the concepts, okay? So this can be perhaps thought of as an example of acquiring the correct category cognitive constructs in the absence of perceptual distinctions to correctly apply those constructs. And this is where I would say a stark example arises where you have a strong non-perceptual component driving the type of categorization structure that you see in those individuals. Okay. Just to present a couple more examples, I have a few more minutes, right? To say a little bit about pragmatic color salience and inhomogeneous color utility, I just want to review some factors that are likely to influence human categorization and maybe see whether they can be addressed in simulation methods. One of the ways that's actually been looked at in, for example, the work by Stills and Belpime is what are the differences in an environmental sampling or environmental color diet, if you will, for different environments that you might be exposed to. How do those impact color categorization types of solutions? this has not been really deeply looked at from the point of view of empirical data like word color survey. I think it would be interesting to consider those possible impacts on those data. And secondly, as Natasha suggested, when you have a pragmatic need to communicate about color and to be accurate about it, then knowing what the correct category assignments are from the point of view of this kind of exogenous, kind of social and evolutionary sound type of strategy is to be able to do the correct assignments for valid food sources. But there's also a whole set of needs that arise from the point of view of social utility when color gets incorporated into a society and considered useful as a kind of a bias, if you will, for having it present in the culture and marked in the culture. So, for example, one thing we know is that in about the 6th century, blue was not a term that was introduced into the English language, but later got adopted when the church thought it was an important type of distinction to make in addition to the clerical red and yellow and black and white that they had incorporated in the language. And now it became important for learned people to somehow be able to know what the denotative range of this new term was and to be able to use it in illustrated manuscripts and so on and so forth. So here's a case where there was a kind of a social utility that arose from the point of view of the church, pressure from the church to adopt blue in early English. Okay. Finally, I want to just say that we do know that in the World Color Survey and in particular that there are a number of languages that don't partition seemingly on the basis of hue. Sometimes it seems like they have a different dimensional emphasis. Okay, this needs to be explored kind of rigorously to make the statement. But it seems very likely that what you have is cultures making different dimensional distinctions in terms of the color space. All right. So some cultures may emphasize warm versus cool, and this was known in the work by Roche and early on in the color type of research, and that other culturally specific dimensions may exist. And in particular, you could have a dimension that represented something having to do with produce that was valuable to the culture, desiccation and freshness, or the idea of maybe deep and pale appearances forming a polar opposition. I think the important thing to emphasize here, and it's actually a kind of an important point in the interpoint distance model, is that while these perceptual processing constraints are important for modeling color categorization, it may be that what we're looking for in terms of universals are things more akin to what Garner discussed in his Theory of Information Processing in 1974, things having to do with things like polar opposition and symmetry in terms of looking at dimensional emphasis and things of that nature. So maybe higher order types of cognitive concepts that might appear that greatly constrain how category partitioning is done, but don't completely determine it and allow a lot of flexibility when you start to introduce social utility and all these other types of things. So I'd just like to suggest that even though there's been some discussion that there may not be as much universalism as one had hoped for, we may find it in some higher order kind of dimensional emphases or these cognitive constructs like symmetry and polar opposition. Okay. And just to give an example that's been discussed a lot by Debbie Roberson and colleagues, this is a pragmatically defined dimension of Barimno in terms of tulip leaves that are good to eat are bright green, whereas ones that are not good to eat are this more yellow color. And they actually have a category distinction that may look like a yellow and green glosses from the point of view of our standard English model, right? The fact that we think it's a salient term from the point of view of perceptual primitives, but actually for this culture, it's a practical constraint rather than a perceptual constraint that gives rise to those category distinctions. And although there's no dichromats in Brimno, they wouldn't be able to use this distinction because they would have a hard time telling the difference between a null and war tulip leaf. Okay. Okay, so finally, I just want to say very briefly that in the interest of kind of saying how these category solutions that we came up with relate to the empirical data, even though we're not modeling humans, we're trying to understand how the solutions come out in terms of connected set partitions and all that stuff. We might want to ask how our simulation results compare to the empirical data. And the most interesting question to ask, of course, is, okay, we've shown that if you introduce heterogeneity into the population, it makes a difference in terms of the category solutions. It makes a difference where the boundaries occur. They occur from a certain relation to the axis of confusion and all these kinds of things, okay? So would it be the case that in the empirical data, if you look at populations that have dichromats versus those that do not have dichromats, and populations that have the same number of categories in their ethnolinguistic systems, is it the case that you get different boundaries set up for these two populations? This is a question I would love to be able to answer definitively, but unfortunately, in the world color survey data, there are no dichromats, okay, because dichromat varies by ethnic frequency and by different ethnicities, and where these languages were studied are not in the areas where there are strong dichromat populations. So that rules out that data. But if you go back to the original Berlin and Kate book and you try to find examples of languages that, for example, have 11 color terms and no dichromats, and another population that has 11 color terms and say 4% dichromats, there's very few comparisons you can make. I think I found 2. And I didn't want to do the comparison because they were, for example, Japanese, which could be somewhat problematic in terms of its having 2 greens or this kind of thing. So there's an interesting thing that might be done here to find some data that would make this comparison possible. Instead, what I did was I just said, forget about the idea of comparing actual boundaries, but just let's look at where our boundary solutions fall for some aggregate solution of the world color survey data, and ask what kinds of categorization solutions are possible in the absence of an observer model like the CIE-LAB. Well, here's one solution that we, and I picked this solution because it represents the 4 categories that are so prevalent in the aggregate plot of the world color survey. So it's not like I cherry picked it. I just picked this one because it gives you the 4 categories that you see in the world color survey. This is a heterogeneous population with the categories basically formed along this, where I've made these marks here. You have red wrapping around and continuing over here, and you have, a yellow category with fuzziness because of the sloping line, and a green category, and so on and so forth. And those are the denotative ranges of our simulation solutions. And if I take the perimeter of the equator of the stimulus that's looked at in the world color survey, and I just pull out where those contours are in terms of the aggregate contours across 110 languages for yellow and red and green and blue, and I compare those by looking at the range of where those categories lie in this window, then I can show that where the brackets occur from the world color survey data, they seem to correspond with the regions that we've identified in our simulation study for those categories along that equator. Okay. Now this is kind of a sketchy comparison because, these are boundaries, these are category regions defined, and these are actually best exemplar regions defined. So it's not a direct comparison, but I want to just at least give you an impression that there's a possibility of doing a correspondence here given the right kind of a simulation and the right kind of empirical data.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Which version of your model was this?
This is the one with, so this is the line model of dichromats with we started off with 6 categories and it dropped down to 4. And this is with the confusion region being 12, KSim being 6, and this is just 10% dichromats.
So no region of increased signals.
No, I didn't put that in. Yeah, but presumably that would change the solution also. Okay.
Do you think if you took the dichromats out, you'd get something different?
I would have looked at that, but we don't have a solution, homogeneous solution that permits this comparison because it's all either larger or smaller number categories or integral.
No, without dichromats, it's the same solution, but the boundaries could be anywhere.
So it'll rotate.
So the presence of dichromats only fixes the boundaries.
But we don't have the comparison actually to make, so we didn't have the simulation to make, so. I didn't see it. That's what I asked you about last night. Yeah. Okay. So to finish up, I mean, I think Natasha did the summary that needed to be done, but I just want to say very clearly that in my mind, it's obvious to me that we have symmetry breaking types of results from what you showed. You showed that there was a rotation, the rotations that weren't as good as some zero solution, and that was optimal. Okay. Clearly, that's a symmetry breaking type of finding that is due to the perceptual model that's being used in analyzing the data. We showed in the absence of a perceptual model, we come up with similar types of symmetry breaking types of effects for different reasons. You know, color utility, regions of increased salience, all these kinds of things. All right. The interesting empirical question, and one I think that can be addressed by simulation, is how do these things converge together and trade off and come up? And is there any way to incorporate, using simulation studies, a set of parameters, a set of factors that will allow us to get close to how some of these cultures evolve their systems? So we could take a model of Beremno and we could build in the tulip leaf distinction or whatever one you want, right? You know, we could take in that Hanunu and put in the desiccation and freshness type of thing. But the point is this is not something we can look at in the empirical data, but it's something that can be uniquely considered using the simulation approach. So I think it'd be a nice complement to the actual study of the empirical stuff. And so that's basically it. Natasha, come up here. Come up here. Yeah.
So, you know, I'm not much of a nativist, but I was under the impression that, you know, earlier research by people who share your last name, for example, had made a very clear statement about the existence of certain kinds of, you know, null points, at least, on the color line, where there was neither green nor red.
Mm-hmm.
And you alluded to that a little bit, I guess, in the point about the individual differences.
Yeah.
But it was just sort of striking how little of a role that played in any of what you talked about. I mean, I just wonder whether that's, you just think that it's uninteresting to explore the possibility that those kinds of things could be anchoring points, or you know, yeah.
So what you're asking me is if we built into our agents unique Hue points in the circle, would that A provide an anchor for the solution?
Yeah.
Well, anything we put in from a perceptual processing standpoint and make salient from the point of view of KSim or any other type of parameter is gonna help along the solutions. Okay, so that I would.
And it could be extremely weak. You know,
Okay.
These things get, you know, amplified and boosted when people sort of share communicative concerns.
Right.
with each other.
But having said it's going to make a difference, I do want to add the caveat that, you know, in some populations, well, in the populations that have been tested so far, and of course the World Color Survey populations have not done unique Hue settings, but, you know, but in the populations that have been tested so far, there's a lot of variation in the individual unique Hue settings. They're reliable within an individual, but there's a lot of variation as to where they appear, you know, in terms of their ratio mixtures in across the population. So the question is, I mean, that was that graph with the green that I showed you, and
Right,
with the
no,
wide
I-
distribution,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So the question is, if this is some kind of, you know, they want to call them like fundamental kind of primitives of a color space. Well, where do you put it if you're modeling if you want to build it into a kind of an aggregate model of your population, it's not clear where you place it because there's so much variation. So the ideal thing would be to have, 15 different models of what unique Hue settings were, realistic ones. Build your agents with those, and then see how things played out. And we're actually in the process of building agents based on this kind of data. Not actual unique Hue settings, but the whole discrimination J&D profile around the Hue circle. So, I mean, that would be a much more constraining factor. And, whether the individual variation makes the solutions, more variable, take longer, all those things, those are empirical questions we'll be looking at. So, yeah.
So you mentioned that there's the possibility for diachronic studies of evolution of color terms. And wondering what sort of data there is on how color terms have changed.
Well, I mean, Paul can probably say a lot about that, and my impression from the diachronic data that's out there on how color terms came into languages, dropped out, borrowing from, from invading cultures and all this kind of thing, it's all historical data and it's very spotty. And so you can come up with a few instances from, written history, but even then it's subjective. So it's hard to do those kinds of, diachronic studies. Paul's done some, and like I said, he can probably say some more about it. The interesting question would be to look at the dynamics of how terms come in and fall out of our simulations, because that does happen. We start with societies with fixed number of terms, and then depending upon the parameter settings, new terms come in or drop out. So the study of how the diachronics unfolds in that abstract way under different kinds of constraints that we might impose is an interesting question. We could bring in an invading group of agents, have them have a different set of color terms, have them communicate with our existing population and see how that plans out. So when I say diachronic, I mean from a simulation standpoint and not from the classical way that it's been done in linguistics. Paul?
When you say that in your simulation new terms come in and drop out, would that be the same as new categories are formed and old categories are
Yeah.
Because that's really different from new terms coming in.
Okay,
and
yeah,
dropping
of
out
course.
When you talk about real languages, because
Yeah.
categories get renamed a
Yeah.
lot,
Yeah.
but they hardly ever get lost.
Very, very good point.
There's very little evidence of historically going from more color categories to fewer. There's one or two or three cases, and they're all arguable, but they have been made. But that's it. There's huge amount of evidence of people gaining color. Languages gaining color categories by making finer cuts. But once a cut is made, very rarely collapse.
But can I ask you a question about that? Because how would you know if something got dropped out? I mean, suppose it happened in ancient history, before we were writing a lot of this information down. How would you know if something got dropped out and came back in from the existing data?
Came back in?
Well, I mean, how would you know what you suggested, that things never drop out? So there's a possibility it could come back in too. So that's been discussed as well. But
there are methods of reconstruction so that you can tell very often what are older terms in the language. We can very, very often observe cases in which younger members of the speech community have more color terms than older members of the speech community. That's extremely common. And the inference from that is that when by the time these people get older, the old ones die off, you'll have more color terms. But okay, what would constitute?
I mean, I just don't think that evidence is all that compelling. That
Presumably, when a language starts to die, it loses some of the lower frequency color terms.
In cases of language death, when the language is really becoming unviable, no longer viable. It might happen that you might. I don't know if that's been looked at, but it's certainly possible.
Yeah, it's not my expertise. I don't know what the data is on losing categories. I only know what we've seen in these simulations as possible structures.
There was one argument that a fellow named Crystal made the other day, that there was loss of a basic color term for blue in Latin going to the Italic dialects, where there are many Italic dialects have just a term for green or blue, which is verde or verde. Crystal argued that something like caruleus was a basic color term for blue in Latin that got lost to these Italic dialects. But looking at the same sources that he looked at, I don't think that caruleus was a basic color term for blue in Latin. There's a ton of evidence that viridis or viridis, which became verde, was a group term, and that caruleus was something that occurred in the written language in high registers and so on like that, but was never part of the vernacular, and of course wouldn't be reflected in local dialects. But he might be right, I might be wrong.
Yeah, and I just think in general.
One documented case of the loss of a color term.
But even so, it's hard to talk about that kind of data as being, as being convincing.
Tell us that story. Good.
Well, another example of a color term loss is my children. So I'm Russian, so we have two color terms for blue. And my children, the older one uses both of them intermittently, and the younger one uses one term. And they both speak Russian.
What about the
Which one was lost? Goluboy? What? Was Goluboy lost? Which one was lost?
No, she uses Goluboy.
Okay. Yeah, the dark blue was lost. Yeah.
So then should we compare with, say, linguistic change, where for the most part you think of phonetic categories or other things like case, usually you find overwhelmingly the things get simplified, that phonemes merge, distinctions which used to be made before get lost. It's rarely the case that phonemic inventory expands very significantly. Cases also, in the past, lots of languages have very rich case systems, those tend to collapse. And so there seems to be a pressure to simplify. On the other hand, with color categories, it seems like they complexify it.
I think that vocabulary generally tends to grow more than this way.
That complexity of the data sort of, so there's stories about why we lost case markings in English that have to do with the fact that they differ in two cultures that came together across the Danelaw style, which could explain that kind of thing happening.
Well, I should say that there is something very fundamentally different in the sense that the phonemes are building blocks of syllables and words. So if you reduce the number of phonemes in your inventory, you start having longer words. I mean, there is no logical reason why we couldn't work with just one consonant, one vowel, and build all our words out of that binary alphabet. But it's not clear at all that color categories have any such combinatorial. Are we building more complex categories by combining color categories? So that pressure is not there at all.
Yeah, I think in general, analogies between phonology and semantics can be stretched way too far.
I think Luke had a question.
Sure. And then we should probably adjourn.
No, so in the stuff that we did, we never managed to get the universal focal points.
Yeah.
But so you in what you show is that you do get correspondence
No, we did boundaries. We didn't do focal points. What I showed was that the boundary ranges, their focal points fell within our boundary ranges. That's what I showed.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, but that would already be
Okay.
nice.
Yeah.
But so, according to what you say, it's because you have this heterogeneous population that is forcing, the right kind of shifts and all that?
That was a heterogeneous population. We came up with similar types of solutions for the homogeneous population. The interesting thing about the heterogeneous comparison, which I compared with your results, was that when done in a way that's non-random, you get interesting axes that anchor the solutions, and they do so in very clear ways that are concordant with those axes. So.
We'll try
Yeah.
your thing on our CCTV.
Yeah. Okay.
Well,
Good.
let's thank our speakers.
Thanks.